Which starting class in Elden Ring is actually the best? I've seen people beat the game with starting gear before, but that doesn't really matter for which starting class you pick. Because after a certain point, which starting class you pick doesn't matter at all. Because you can just change your build. So today, I'm going to just be beating Margit with every starting class to see which ones fare well and which ones don't. I think that's a better, more accurate representation of which classes are actually good than which weapons do well against Elden Beast. So I'll only be using starting gear at +0 for every class, but I will be using Fanged Imps because I just want the DPS. I don't want to have to beat Margit like 10 times without any summons at level 1 gear, because that just sounds a lot more painful than it needs to be. And you can start with the Fanged Imps anyway, so I'm just going to do that. And I think we all know that the Samurai is probably the strongest class. But I am going to try to prove that it's not the only one that can have a really easy time in the early game. I forgot to mention that I'll also be using one extra flask than you start with, just because it's right outside Margit's arena. I think it's safe to say that literally every person that fights Margit is going to be having that at least one extra flask. It's the only thing I'm using that you don't literally start with, but it's intended to be used for the Margit fight, so yeah, I'll just be picking up one golden seed, but I think that's hardly an issue. And that's just to make things easier for me. That won't affect which classes are good and which aren't, because you already start with, I think, 4, so 5 won't really make a difference. But yeah, now let's get into it. Starting out with our only F tier class, we have the Bandit. It's just bad. It doesn't have any stagger potential. The bleed on the Great Knife is nice, but it does not do any kind of DPS. And the range is really bad too. If the Great Knife didn't have bleed, I would never, ever start with this class in a million years. But even picking up like the Lordsworn's Greatsword would make this class viable. So I can't talk too much trash about it just because the weapon sucks. Because it's literally a knife. It's just bad. I think I stagger Margit once in this fight by spamming strong heavies all the fight, but he took me 5 attempts to beat, which is a lot. So he's just a bad class. Bandit would not recommend unless you're changing out your weapon straight away. I forgot to say he does have a buckler, which can be used against Margit, but this isn't Dark Souls 3, this isn't Bloodborne, so obviously the parrying is a lot more difficult, so I didn't even try. And his armor's really squishy too. Not a lot of protection there, so it's just not a great class. F tier. At the bottom of C tier, we have the first real class, which is the Warrior. The Warrior took me 6 attempts to beat Margit, which is more than the Bandit, which I'm a little embarrassed about, but this class isn't great either. The gimmick of dual-wielding curved swords is kind of neat, but I just switched one of them out so I could just have one, because the dual wield moveset is okay for DPS, but it doesn't stagger very well, and just doing heavy attacks with one is probably better. Later game, this starting gear might be better because you could put bleed on one sword and frost on another, get some really good status effect buildup, but you're not going to be doing that in the Margit fight. So this is just a really underwhelming class because he does have good DPS, but he doesn't stagger especially well, and he is pretty squishy. So overall, he's just mid C tier. At the top of C tier, we have the Prisoner. Now, the Prisoner is one of those classes that struggles early game, but has a really strong middle and end game, at least if you stick with its gimmick and gear. But this class would be made so much better if you just talk to Selin and get Glintstone Pebble, which you can easily do before this fight, but obviously I chose not to. Magic Glint Blade just isn't that good. It's not FP efficient. It doesn't do enough stagger or damage to really be worth using over the stock, so I just stuck with it. Its Ash of War was decent, but if it just had Glintstone Pebble, it would just be a better Astrologer, which obviously is a lot better because we haven't seen it yet. Like, Prisoner has the potential to be an A or even S tier class without much effort. It's just getting Glintstone Pebble would make this build a million times better. But with the starting gear, it is a C tier. It is really underwhelming. Doesn't have a whole lot of defense. The Ash of War on the S-Stock is decent, but it is not a melee-focused class. It's a hybrid. It's just the magic isn't pulling its weight. Prisoner is going to be a high C tier. I almost considered putting it in like a B- tier, but I decided to just throw it in C because it did take me 4 attempts to beat. So yeah, he's going to be a C tier. At the bottom of B tier, we have the Wretch. The Wretch making it this high might surprise a lot of people, but it's actually not a bad class, even without any armor. Obviously, being level 1 and naked, it is really squishy and doesn't have very great damage per second, but the club is just a really good early game weapon. To start off, it has a really good buffing Ash of War. Normally, you'd want an Ash of War that can stagger bosses really easily, but a buffing Ash of War is still really good. In addition, the club's heavy attacks do stagger really well, so it doesn't really need a staggering Ash of War to be viable. That being said, it does have its downsides. You really can't get hit or do a lot of damage, so you're just playing for staggers and reposts. That being said, it still only took me 2 attempts to beat Margit with the Wretch, so it is a relatively decent class. It should really only be used if you are playing for staggers, though, because if you're playing too passively, this will not work. You have to be really aggressive, really spamming those heavy those charged heavy attacks to knock him. B tier. At the top of B tier, we have the hero class. The hero has pretty decent DPS, but the axe moveset is just bad. I don't know if there's a single good axe type weapon in the entire game, and the starting axe is no exception. That being said, though, it does still have some good damage and pretty decent stagger potential, but that's only if you are really aggressive. Wild Strikes is a really nice Asher War to have, though. The hero's armor is pretty light, but the hero starts with a decent amount of vigor, so it doesn't matter that much. This class only took me 2 attempts to beat Margit. It just felt a little underwhelming. If the hero had anything else going for it, I may have put it in A tier, but as it stands, it just feels mid. It's not a bad class, but it's not going to carry you through the early game. It's not bad by any means, which is why I put it in the top of B tier. It just felt a little awkward with the axe moveset. It's not bad. B tier. Starting out the good classes, we have the Vagabond. The Vagabond being this low might surprise some people, but I promise you it's not that good. He has really good vigor and really good armor, so he can take a few hits from Margit, but it's still nothing spectacular. But in early game, no amount of vigor you have is going to be spectacular unless you kill Grail. His straight sword is really nice with its Asher War. Its DPS and regular stagger aren't incredible, but the Asher War is really, really nice for getting those staggers. So as long as you're playing for reposts, Margit is really easy. He really only took me 2 attempts because I messed up on the first one, because this is the first one I recorded. A tier. In the middle of the A tier, we have the Astrologer. The Astrologer is the first class that took me only 1 attempt to beat, just because sorceries are overpowered. Admittedly, this fight would probably be a lot harder if I did not have the Fanged Imps, but I chose to, and that's what I'm basing my rankings on, so as it stands, it's an A tier. Glintstone Pebble does a lot of DPS for how much FP it costs, which isn't much at all. You can just spam it and do a lot of damage. And the short sword, it can be a decent close range option as well. All in all, this class doesn't have any real weakness other than low vigor and squishiness in general, but that won't be a problem if you're throwing glintstone pebbles from halfway across the arena. A tier. At the top of the A tier, we have the Confessor. This is a class that really surprised me. It basically just felt like the Vagabond, but with extra faith and a healing incantation. He has the same great Asher War as the Vagabond, as well as good vigor. This class could easily be S tier if you just purchase Catch Flame from Brother Corin and the Round Table Hold. I couldn't do that because I was just using starting gear, but doing that would make this class infinitely better just because you'd have that up close burst damage option. Overall, though, he basically was the same as the Vagabond, but he only took me one attempt. I didn't even end up needing to use the urgent heal because I still had extra vigor flasks, extra Estus flasks. But having that insurance in the urgent heal did make me more confident. A tier. The first S tier class is the Profet. I think most people saw this one coming, especially after I mentioned Catch Flame. Catch Flame is just a really, really powerful incantation, especially in early game, because it's really, really fast coming out, does high damage, and some good stagger poise damage. In addition to this, the short spear that the Profet starts with does have a really decent Ash of War, for staggering at least. Charge Forth isn't an especially amazing Ash, but it does work out, especially for staggering. Even with starting incantations, the Prophet's just such a great class. I had to put it in S tier. He only took me one attempt, and it was a really easy one too. S tier. Okay, I think everybody knew that the Samurai was the best class, and I agree, so I'm putting it at the top of S tier. To start off, the armor and vigor are really decent for the early game, so you won't have to chug Estus as much as other classes. That's not why people pick the Samurai, though. They pick it for the weapon, the Uchigatana. The Uchigatana has twice as much innate bleed buildup as the Great Knife, which is kind of overpowered in and of itself, but its Ash of War Unsheath also does an insane amount of poise damage. Overall, nothing can compete with the Samurai. S tier. Thank you for watching. Like for more Elden Ring videos.